"You're next." Those were the words my only son whispered in my ear. Not during some argument, but right in front of the freshly polished casket of his aunt, my sister. While the air was thick with incense and melted wax, he just reeked of cheap bourbon and an impatient greed. He looked at me, not as a grieving father, but as an old tree that was in the way, a final obstacle between him and his inheritance. He thought my hands, calloused from 60 years of working wood, were only good for building my own coffin. What he could never imagine is that with these same hands, and in the silence of my workshop, I was already building a trap. A masterpiece of patience and deception assembled with family secrets and invisible ink. And you'd never guess that the key piece to destroying his whole plan was hidden in plain sight in the elegant signature of a woman who could no longer speak. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening from in the comments below. I stood straight, my hands clasped behind my back, silently looking at the oak casket of my sister Sarah. It was polished to perfection. The grain of the wood was straight and even, without a single knot, without a single flaw. Impeccable work. I had chosen every plank myself, planed them, joined them, and varnished them with my own hands. It was the last thing I could do for her. Around me, the dense air smelled of incense and melting beeswax, a sacred, heavy aroma that was familiar to me from countless funerals. The yellowish light from the tall candles fought against the shadows in the alcoves of the old North Church, drawing trembling reflections on the cold Vermont marble. Sobs and whispers of condolence floated in the air, but to me, they were just meaningless background noise. I only heard the church bells, tolling with a solemn slowness as if counting the lost years. Sarah was gone. Half of my soul, the sister who had always been my lighthouse in the storms of life, was gone. David, my son, approached. I felt his presence before I saw him. He brought a different aura with him, an air of agitation, of impatience. He was wearing an expensive suit, but the collar of his shirt was slightly wrinkled and his tie was crooked. His eyes darted to the flashy gold watch on his wrist, a gesture that said it all. He wasn't here to mourn a loss. He was here to wait. He leaned in, close to my ear. I could smell the vapor of cheap bourbon on his breath, a vulgar scent, out of place amid the solemnity. It wasn't an embrace of comfort, but an invasion of my personal space. "You're next," he whispered. The icy phrase sank into the toll of the bell that had just rung. Without looking up at me, he immediately pulled back, blending into the crowd of mourners and leaving me alone with his poisonous threat hanging in the air. I didn't feel fear. The initial shock was quickly smothered by a cold emptiness. My calloused hands, the fruit of 60 years working wood, clenched behind my back. He looked at me the way you look at an old tree, about to be felled. He didn't see the tight rings of life inside. He didn't see the grain that had hardened and strengthened through countless storms. He only saw the profit he would get from my fall. He only saw my shadow covering the land he coveted. I looked up at the historic stained glass window, with its intricate and patient designs, a legacy David could never understand. He was the product of another world, a world of speed, of fleeting transactions and instant profits. He didn't understand the value of things that take time to create, and that was his fatal error. A few days later, at dusk, I was alone in the workshop. The funeral was over. The distant relatives had returned to their homes, leaving a heavy silence that enveloped the house and the Miller family woodshop. Fine particles of sawdust floated in the last rays of sun filtering through the window, dancing like tiny souls. The familiar aroma of cedar, walnut, and linseed oil surrounded me, a perfume more comforting than any word of condolence. With my bare hand, I wiped the dust from a walnut dresser, one of the first pieces my sister and I made together when I was just an apprentice. My calloused fingers traced a dovetail joint, so precise it was almost invisible. Every curve, every angle was a memory. I closed my eyes, and the memory returned, as vivid as if it were yesterday. It was a suffocating summer afternoon in 2008, when the financial crisis swept through the country like a hurricane, nearly sinking the family workshop. I was sitting right here, surrounded by half-finished furniture, my mind blank, staring at a pile of collection notices. Sarah came in, quiet as always. She didn't say much. She just sat next to me on the small, shady brick patio behind the workshop, where the sound of the small fountain always brought a sense of peace. She put a glass of fresh squeezed orange juice in my hand. The fragrant, sharp smell flooded my senses. "Ray," she said, her voice steady and firm. "In woodworking, just like in life, you always have to keep a reserve plank in the rafters. Never let people see everything you have." I managed a tired smile. "You're always so prepared." Sarah looked at me, her eyes serious. "Because you're not." The next day, she used her life savings and took out a second mortgage on her house to save the workshop. She didn't ask for a single word of thanks. She only demanded one promise, that I would always be prepared for stormy days. Her words echoed now in the silent workshop, taking on a new meaning, a new weight, a reserve plank. It wasn't just about money. It was knowledge, preparation, moves calculated in advance. I got up and went to an oak-paneled wall in my small office. At first glance, it was no different from the others. But to me, it was a chest of secrets. I ran my hand over the panels, feeling every familiar grain, until my fingers stopped on a discreet knot that only I knew. I pressed gently. A dry click echoed, and a section of the wall swung open, revealing a hidden compartment inside. There was no money or gold. There were leather-bound folders, meticulously labeled Napa Valley Deeds, Timber Contracts 2010, Tax Documents 2008-2015, and the most important one, Will and Power of Attorney. I had spent the last decade after the 2008 crash studying law on my own, consulting with the best, quietly building a legal fortress around the family assets. David thought he was hunting an old, weak lion. He didn't know this lion had been setting traps throughout his own jungle for years. Sleep eluded me in the nights that followed the burial. The pain of the loss and David's threat intertwined, creating a monster that devoured the quiet of the night. Around 3 a.m, giving up the useless effort, I put on a thin robe and went out onto the balcony. The Boston night air was cool and carried the faint scent of jasmine from a neighbor's garden. The cobblestone lane of the north end was submerged in the yellowish light of the street lamps. Everything was calm, familiar, except for one detail. My gaze fell on a sleek black sedan parked under a maple tree on the corner. A strange presence, incongruous among the brick facades and old wooden doors. I had never seen it around here. I stood in the darkness, watching. The car's lights were off. Its interior was a black smudge. It was just there, like a crouched predator, waiting. I stood for almost half an hour, but no one got in or out. The next morning, when I went out to get coffee in the Boston Globe as usual, I saw the car was still there. The curiosity of the craftsman, the man who pays attention to every detail, was awakened. I decided to take the long way around, coming back from the start of the lane so I could pass by it. As I got close, I executed a move I had rehearsed in my mind since the night before. I accidentally dropped my set of keys. The sound of metal on the cobblestones was sharp and clear. I bent down to pick them up, but my eyes weren't on the keys. My gaze quickly swept the car's interior through the glass. No one. The passenger seat was reclined. On the dashboard was a Boston Herald sports section, and next to it, a crumpled pack of Marlboros. On the floor, a blue bottle of water, unmistakably Evian. I straightened up, put the keys in my pocket, and continued on my way as if nothing had happened. But in my head, the details were already sorting themselves out. Marlboros, the Herald, and a bottle of Evian. A sports fan who smokes cheap cigarettes and drinks expensive bottled water. A man of contradictions, like my son. Someone hired to watch but too careless. A novice hunter who doesn't know how to hide his tracks. They leave their scent everywhere. David didn't have the patience to do this job himself. He had hired someone. And that meant he wasn't alone. The trap wasn't being set by a single amateur. There was someone more professional pulling the strings from the shadows. The feeling of being the prey became sharper than ever. 2 weeks later, I got a call from David. His voice sounded falsely jovial. He said he had to go to New York City for a few days to meet with an important partner. He asked about my health in a superficial way. New York. I have an oak supplier I've used for years near there. It was the perfect excuse. I told my foreman I needed to personally inspect a new shipment of lumber and booked an Acela ticket to New York for the next morning. The capital of the world received me with its noise and its coldness, a stark contrast to the warm, close-knit feel of Boston. I didn't go to see my supplier. Instead, I rented a car and drove to the Upper East Side, the district of luxury boutiques and stately apartments. I knew my son. He wouldn't meet an important partner in just any coffee shop. I was right. I found his sports car parked in front of a discreet but expensive lounge bar. I left my car in a nearby garage, adjusted my simple jacket, and went in. The interior was bathed in soft light, with chill-out music in the background and elegantly dressed people conversing in low voices. I chose an out-of-the-way corner where I could observe without being seen and ordered a club soda. And then I saw them. David was sitting across from a man older than him, in his late 50s, with graying hair slicked back. He wore an impeccably tailored suit that radiated a quiet power. David, on the other hand, looked submissive, like a schoolboy in front of the principal. The other man was completely relaxed. He slowly swirled a glass of amber-colored high-end scotch with his finger, a subtle but controlling gesture. I knew he was the one behind it all. I couldn't hear the whole conversation, but I could read lips and catch fragments when the waiter passed. "Everything has to be clean, David," I heard the man's voice, smooth as silk but sharp as a razor. "This is all built on trust." "He's a stubborn old man," David replied, his voice impatient, "but he'll give in. The papers will look like they just came from the printer." The papers. My heart skipped a beat. They were talking about the will. The man set down his glass and a cold smile flickered across his lips. "I don't doubt it, but remember, no noise. I hate noise." Marcus Thorne. The name suddenly came to me. I'd heard of him in business circles, a predatory investor specializing in taking over family assets in distress through legal trickery. He was a shark, and my son had willingly climbed into his mouth. I paid quietly and left before they finished. On the train back to Boston, I didn't look out the window. I looked at my own reflection in the dark glass. I saw an old man, but in his eyes the fire had not yet gone out. Back in Boston, I didn't waste time. David's words, "The papers will look like they just came from the printer," obsessed me. I needed to know what they had done. The next morning, I headed to the law office of Mr. Evans, an old family friend who had handled countless documents for the Miller woodshop over the last 40 years. His office was the same as always, old-fashioned with its characteristic smell of old books and printer's ink. I didn't get straight to the point. I know how to talk to old-school Bostonians. We started by asking about health, family, the kids. We talked about the Red Sox game the night before. We complained about the weather. After almost half an hour of chat, I casually mentioned my sister, Sarah. "I'm sorting out some of her papers, Mr. Evans," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Just to get everything in order. Could I take a look at her property file, just to make sure I'm not missing anything?" Mr. Evans, with the respect due to a lifelong client, agreed immediately. He took me to the digital archives room. On the computer screen, the files were neatly arranged. He clicked on the folder, Sarah Miller. A list of documents appeared, and then I saw it, a file named Handwritten Will, Update. My heart pounded, but my expression didn't change. A handwritten will. The simplest type of will, but also the easiest to forge. "Could you open this file, please?" I asked. The scan of a handwritten document appeared on the screen. The handwriting was very similar to Sarah's. The content was brief. It declared all previous wills null and void and bequeathed her entire estate to the only remaining male heir in the Miller family, David. "Can you zoom in on the signature, please?" Mr. Evans enlarged the bottom of the page. The signature, Sarah Miller, appeared clearly. My calloused fingers moved unconsciously in the air, tracing every curve, every loop. I knew my sister's signature better than my own. "Mr. Evans," I said slowly, "take a look at this signature. Is that Sarah's?" The old man squinted, staring at the screen. He was a lawyer. His whole life had been spent working with letters and signatures. He had a trained eye. "It looks like it, Ray," he replied, his voice hesitant, "but it's too perfect." Sarah, at her age, her hand was already a bit shaky. Her signature used to have a little hesitation on the M. Exactly, I thought, and there's more. Sarah's signature always ended with a little hook on the R, a habit from her youth when she learned calligraphy. This signature was a soulless copy, like a piece of furniture mass-produced by a CNC machine. It lacked the mark of the human hand, the spirit of the writer. I had my first piece of proof. A crack had appeared in their perfect work. And for a carpenter, a single crack is enough to split a plank in two. Martha Shaw's office was on the top floor of a modern building overlooking the Charles River, a space that seemed deliberately opposed to the warm, old city that spread out below. Everything in her office was sharp, minimalist, and cold. A thick glass desk, black leather chairs without a single wrinkle, immaculately white walls, and a huge, abstract painting with violent red and black slashes like an open wound. She was the embodiment of New York in the heart of Boston, direct, efficient, without a single superfluous detail. She wasn't the kind of lawyer who would pat you on the back with empty words. She was the kind of lawyer who would analyze your problem like a surgeon, locate the tumor, and offer you a sharp scalpel. I placed the thin dossier I had assembled on the glass table. The printout of the fake will, my notes on the strange car, the name Marcus Thorne. The slight sound echoed in the almost absolute silence of the room. Martha didn't open it immediately. She poured 2 glasses of ice water from a glass pitcher with tiny bubbles clinging to the sides. She slid 1 glass toward me, a polite but mechanical gesture, and only then did she put on a pair of thin-framed glasses and begin to read. She read in silence. Her concentration was almost tangible, creating a pressure zone around the table. Occasionally she drummed a finger on the glass, a tick that revealed her brain was working at high speed, connecting facts, weighing possibilities. I, a man used to working with his hands, felt almost out of place in this world of abstract strategies. I could feel the texture of the wood, predict how the grain would respond to the gouge. But here I had to place my faith in someone who could see the twisted grains and knots in the arid body of the law. Finally, she looked up, her gaze as sharp as her glasses, devoid of emotion. "They used a handwritten will because they thought it was simple and hard to trace," she said. "An amateur's choice. They thought imitating the signature was enough. Mistake. Simplicity is precisely where the most traces are left. Like a white wall, any stain, no matter how small, becomes obvious." "I need you to help me sharpen this knife," I said, my voice low and firm, trying to convey my determination. Martha looked me straight in the eye, a penetrating gaze that seemed to read even what I didn't say. "No, Mr. Miller. A knife can be intercepted. A knife only works for a frontal assault, and your adversary, Marcus Thorne, isn't one to fight head-on. He's a spider. He weaves his web and waits. We can't charge at his web." She paused to give her words weight. "I will help you build the perfect trap, a legal labyrinth that, once they enter, they will never find their way out of. We won't attack. We will lure. We will make them walk confidently into what they believe is an escape route. Your job is to prepare the bait." She pushed the dossier back toward me. "And the first bait, the cornerstone of this entire construction, is irrefutable proof. We need a sample of your sister's authentic signature from the same period as the date on the fake will. A contract, a power of attorney, anything certified by a lawyer. Find it." An authentic signature sample. Martha's words repeated in my head on the way home. Sarah was a careful woman, but she wasn't a woman of paperwork. Most of her deals were based on trust and a handshake. I racked my brain, digging through my memories, trying to find a needle in a haystack. I was about to give up, thinking I'd have to find another way. And then, during one sleepless night, the image flashed. A small detail, seemingly buried by time. 10 years ago, Sarah had bought a small apartment in Lincoln Park, Chicago, to rent out. During the process, since she had to go to Chicago for a few days to visit her daughter, she gave me a limited power of attorney, solely to sign the utility contracts in her name. A trifle. That power had long since expired, but it had been certified by a lawyer. It had been drafted by an old, retired attorney, Mr. Peterson, whose former office was in the city archives. The next morning, Martha and I were there. Mr. Peterson's old office was now a municipal archive, a forgotten, dusty, and suffocating place. The elderly archivist looked at us skeptically over his thick glasses. After some persuasion and the presentation of Martha's legal documentation, he reluctantly led us inside. We spent hours searching, leafing through volumes bound in yellowed leather, in a dense air that smelled of old paper and time. The light from a single ceiling bulb hung down, making the dust motes dance like moths. Finally, when my eyes were exhausted and my back ached, Martha let out a small, sharp breath. In a volume from 2015, we had found it. A short text, just a few lines, legally irrelevant today. But at the bottom of the page was my sister's signature. Sarah Miller. The handwriting was clear, confident, with that characteristic slight tremor on the M and the elegant hook at the end of the R that I remembered so well. I caressed the page with my hand, almost able to feel the warmth of her hand. It wasn't just a signature. It was a piece of her soul that endured. It was alive. It was real. It was her. Martha, on the other hand, showed no emotion. She took out her phone and carefully photographed the document from several angles, making sure every detail was sharp. To her, this wasn't a relic. It was a weapon. "We have the cornerstone," she said, with the satisfied tone of an engineer who has just found the perfect material. "Now, let's build the walls." I was on my patio, my only refuge of peace, pruning the dead leaves from a lemon tree. The murmur of the small fountain and the scent of jasmine created an oasis of calm. That calm was broken by the ringing of the phone. Seeing David on the screen, I took a deep breath, activated the recorder, and slipped into the role of a tired, confused old man. I coughed a couple of times before answering. "Dad?" David's voice on the other end sounded falsely sweet, the tone he only used when he wanted something. "Are you okay? I've been really worried about your health these days." "I'm as always," I answered, my voice weak, letting out a slight wheeze. "A little tired, son. Just getting old." "See, I told you. You need to rest. I've been thinking a lot," he continued. "What if you sign a general power of attorney over to me? That way, I can take care of the paperwork, the bills, all those little things. You wouldn't have to worry about anything. Just enjoy your retirement." A general power of attorney. The master key that would allow him to seize everything legally. I felt a wave of nausea, but I swallowed it. "Let me think about it," I said, dragging out the words like someone struggling to organize their thoughts. "My head's not very clear lately. I'm just so tired." It was time to cast the bait, a bait tailored to his greed. "Oh, by the way, that undeveloped land in Napa. An agent called me the other day. Said some English investment fund, I think they're called Sterling Properties, wants to buy it. They say the land has potential for planting Cabernet grapes. They're offering a good price. But I'm just too old. I don't know how to handle these things." I heard a brief silence on the other end of the line, an almost palpable silence of greed calculating. I could picture his eyes lighting up. "Don't worry, Dad," he rushed to answer, trying and failing to hide his enthusiasm. "Don't do anything, you hear? Let me look into it. Those foreign funds are very complicated. You don't understand this stuff. Don't make any decisions on your own. You just rest. Let me handle everything." He hung up. I turned off the recorder, clenching the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. Disgust rose in my throat. He didn't just want my assets. He wanted to take away my agency, my lucidity, my very self. He wanted to erase me from my own life. 2 days later, as I was getting ready to close the workshop, Martha called with an unusual urgency in her voice. "Mr. Miller, you need to come to my office right now. There's a development. They're speeding up." In her office, the cold electric light had replaced the sunset. She showed me an email forwarded by a colleague of hers in the legal world. It was the draft of a petition for conservatorship, being prepared to be filed with the court. The respondent's name was Ray Miller. They were moving faster than I thought. They didn't just want me to sign over power voluntarily. They wanted to legally turn me into a child, into an empty shell stripped of all rights. "This is a civil death, Mr. Miller," Martha explained. "If this petition is approved, you won't be able to sign a contract. You won't be able to sell a property. You won't even be able to decide on your own medical treatment. All rights would pass to a conservator who would undoubtedly be David." It was a humiliation, an attack on my very being, my dignity. A cold anger ran down my spine. This was no longer a fight for money or property. It was a fight to defend my right to be a person. "We have to act first," Martha said, her voice as cold as steel. Immediately, she drafted a petition to the court for a preliminary injunction. In it, she skillfully explained that I, Ray Miller, was under great psychological pressure following the death of a family member, and that there was a risk my son, drowning in debt, would take advantage of my trust to carry out harmful financial transactions. She requested an urgent order. Any sale of real estate or company shares in my name must, from that moment on, be validated by 2 independent attorneys appointed by the court. This is the first firewall, she said as she sent the petition, an invisible wall, but as solid as rock. David can have a power of attorney, he can have a conservatorship petition, but he won't be able to sell or transfer anything of value without getting past the 2 guardians we've just put in place. We've bought ourselves time. That weekend, Chloe, Sarah's daughter, returned from Chicago. Seeing her on the doorstep with a small suitcase and a deep sadness in her eyes was like seeing my sister 30 years ago. Chloe had Sarah's eyes, intelligent and firm, and an identical stubborn chin. She was a paralegal, a sharp mind wrapped in a sweet appearance. We hugged tightly, an embrace that needed no words. We didn't talk much about what had happened. Instead, she went to the kitchen, rolled up her sleeves, and in a short time, the aroma of fresh bread and tomato soup filled the house, partially dispelling the atmosphere of mourning and tension. We ate dinner in silence, a silence of understanding. It was how Sarah and I used to be, sitting together in the workshop, with only the sound of tools as company. After dinner, she handed me a small cedar box, one of the first I ever made for Sarah. Mom told me, if anything ever happened, to give this to you. I opened the box. Inside were a few small mementos, an old paper fan, an olive wood rosary polished from use, and a yellowed, carefully sealed letter. I recognized Sarah's handwriting. I read it under the kitchen light, my hand trembling slightly. The letter had been written years ago after David had racked up another huge debt. In it, she wrote about her love for Chloe and about the worries and pain David had caused her. "You know his nature, Ray," she wrote. "He has a hole in his soul that no money can fill. He always looks for the easy way out, and that way usually leads to an abyss. Be careful with him." And then, the final paragraph, with lines that seemed written with tears. "If anything happens to me, protect her. She's the best thing I have. Protect her from the greed of the world and also from the greed of her own family. Teach her that dignity is more valuable than all the fortune in the world." The tears came, the first since my sister's death. I folded the letter and carefully put it back in the box. I looked up at Chloe, who also had tears in her eyes. This was no longer just my fight. It was Sarah's last wish. "You know everything, don't you?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Chloe nodded. "The lawyer, Martha, she called me. You're not alone in this, Uncle Ray." She put her hand on mine, a young, warm hand. "I'll do whatever it takes. For my mom. And for you." In that moment, our alliance was sealed. An old carpenter and a young paralegal, united by love and a sacred promise. The following Monday, Martha sent 2 documents to a top-tier forensic document examiner in New York. The scan of the fake will and the scan of the authentic power of attorney we found in the archives. She didn't send them by email. She hired a special courier to ensure the chain of custody was not broken. The days of waiting felt endless. I tried to keep busy in the workshop, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. Every tap of the chisel, every cut of the saw carried the mark of tension. Once, for the first time in 30 years, I messed up a joint. My hand trembled, and the chisel slipped by a millimeter. A minuscule error, but unacceptable to me. I looked at the scar in the cedar wood and saw in it the reflection of the battle I was fighting. A single error, and the whole structure would come down. Finally, on Friday afternoon, Martha called. "I have the report. Can you come to the office?" The 5-page report, carefully bound, was full of technical terms, spectral analysis graphs, and microscopic images. But the conclusion was as clear as day, presented in a cold, blunt manner. First, the chromatographic analysis indicated that the ink used in the fake will was a water-based polymer ink that had only been on the market for the last 2 years. The date on the will was from 5 years ago, an irrefutable timeline discrepancy. Second, The microscopic analysis of the paper fibers revealed that the paper used was a high-quality, acid-free stock, a type Sarah never used. She always used regular cream-colored stationery with a slight texture, which she bought from a small shop near her home. And finally, the definitive proof, the signature analysis. By superimposing both signatures and analyzing the pressure of each stroke, the examiner concluded that the signature on the fake will showed signs of slow imitation. It lacked the fluency and naturalness of an authentic signature. The start and end points of the strokes showed hesitation, a typical characteristic of someone trying to copy meticulously. It is the product of imitation, not a spontaneous act, the report concluded. Martha left the report on the glass table. For the first time, I saw a rare, cold smile on her lips. It wasn't a smile of joy, but of the satisfaction that comes from a complex calculation with the exact result. The paper cut has exposed the handle, she said. Now it's time to sharpen it and prepare the next act. With the expert report in hand, Martha told me, "The evidence is strong enough to go to trial, Mr. Miller, but if we file the lawsuit now, they'll know we've discovered them. They'll try to get rid of what they can. This isn't the time to attack. It's time to build the fortress." And the first wall of that fortress was raised in the office of another lawyer, one in Martha's complete confidence, not Mr. Evans. It was a move that required discretion. I sat in the elegant office, across from the lawyer and Martha, signing a thick stack of documents. Each signature of mine was slow, firm, like when I mark wood with a gouge. This first play had a poetic name, Life Estate, an old legal concept, but as solid as the ancient oaks in New England. By public deed, I re-established my life estate over the family home and the entire Miller workshop. This meant that no matter who legally owned the property, even David, in the worst-case scenario, I would have the full right to use, live in, and profit from them until the day of my death. No one could kick me out of the house and workshop I had built with my sweat and blood. I had become an inseparable part of the assets. But that was just the outer defense. The second move was more subtle. In that same deed, I signed the temporary transfer of the workshop's management to Chloe as managing trainee. In terms of ownership, everything was still in my name. But in terms of operations, cash flow, contracts, Chloe now had the final say. "It's a perfect move," Martha had explained. "If David checks the public records, he'll just see the act of an old man preparing for retirement, wanting to hand over management to his hard-working niece while reserving the profits. A logical, reasonable act. He won't smell the danger. He'll just see the prey weakening on its own." When I put my signature on the last line, the lawyer stamped the document with an embossed seal. The sharp stamp on the paper echoed in the room. Definitive. It was like the last hammer blow that sets a joint in place, airtight, solid, and irreversible. A week later, Martha summoned me to her office. "The first wall has set, Mr. Miller. Time to dig the moat." She explained the next step. She would file a request in the property registry to place a lias pendens, a notice of a pending lawsuit, on all of my and my sister's real estate. "How does that work?" I asked. "Imagine it as a red flag planted on every parcel of land, on every house," she explained, her hands clasped on the glass table. "It doesn't prevent a sale, but it publicly informs that those properties are subject to litigation. No bank will approve a mortgage. No sensible buyer will dare invest money in properties with that red flag. We've essentially frozen their liquid value without needing a court order." "David and Marcus will find out," I said. "Exactly," Martha nodded. "And that's the goal. We're not just digging the moat. We want the predator to know the moat is there. This will make him lose patience. He won't be able to use your sister's assets to get loans. David's creditors will start to pressure. The financial noose around his neck will tighten, step by step." I nodded, but I felt a profound sadness. I was using these cold legal tools against my only son. Every step of Martha's plan was logical, necessary, but it also carved a new scar on my heart. I felt as if I were carving the coffin of my own relationship with him. The next day, Martha filed the notice. A few days later, the invisible red flag was waving over the small Miller family empire. I knew because David called me. His voice was loaded with anger and confusion. I responded calmly that I knew nothing, that it was probably an administrative error and that I'd have it looked into. I had learned to lie to my son, and it disgusted me. David's impatience exploded on a Sunday night. He showed up at the house unannounced, smelling strongly of alcohol. I knew what he had come for. He needed money, and he needed control. Instead of arguing, I invited him to sit at the table. I had anticipated this. I had prepared a classic American dinner, a plate of prosciutto, some sharp Vermont cheddar, and a bottle of silver oak Cabernet I'd been saving for years. We sat across from each other in a dense silence, broken only by the clinking of silverware on the heirloom china. David drank the wine as if it were water, one glass after another. I ate slowly, savoring every slice of prosciutto that melted in my mouth. I am a carpenter. I understand the value of patience. Finally, when the bottle was almost empty, he couldn't take it anymore. "What's this story about the notice on the properties?" he spat. "What the hell are you doing?" "I don't know what you're talking about," I replied, my voice calm. "Stop pretending," he slammed the table, spilling red wine on the white tablecloth. "All my plans are frozen. Why are you doing this, to torment me?" "I'm just protecting the family legacy," I said. "Legacy?" He laughed with contempt. "You're nothing but an old, outdated carpenter clinging to a rotten past. You don't understand how the world works now. Every day you're still alive is a day you're delaying my future." I set my silverware down gently. I wasn't angry. The anger had passed long ago. Now there was only a cold clarity. I looked him straight in the eyes, red from alcohol and desperation. "A warped board isn't a lost board," I said, my voice flat. "If you know how to apply heat in the right place, at the right time, it straightens. The same way they bend the strongest oak staves to make bourbon barrels. It takes fire, water, and above all, time." I paused, staring at him. "You're in too much of a hurry, David. You just want to break the barrel to drink the young whiskey. You don't understand that it's the time in the oak that gives it its value." He was frozen, not knowing how to respond to my metaphor. He just muttered a curse. He got up and staggered away, leaving me alone with the half-eaten dinner and a red wine stain on the tablecloth, looking like a bleeding wound. The beast was cornered. It was hungry and losing patience. It was time to release the best bait. I didn't act directly. I knew my calls might be monitored. Instead, I went to the old bar where my friends always meet. I sat next to Artie, a real estate buddy who, as I knew, was a loudmouth and had dealings with some of David's cronies. We talked about baseball, politics, the grandkids. Then I let out an involuntary sigh. "What's wrong, Ray?" Artie asked. "It's nothing important," I replied, faking exhaustion. "Just that undeveloped land in Napa that Sarah left. This English investment fund, Sterling Properties, won't stop bothering me. They want to buy it to plant Cabernet grapes, and they're paying well. But I'm old. I don't want to get into complicated paperwork with foreigners." I knew Artie wouldn't keep the story to himself, and just as I expected, only 2 days later, David called me, his voice abnormally sweet. He said he'd heard about the deal, and he would help me manage it so I wouldn't have to worry. A week later, he showed up at the workshop with a preliminary contract. "Here you go, Dad," he said, handing me the papers. "I had my lawyer draft it. All the clauses are in our favor. They're going to make a significant down payment. You just have to sign." I put on my glasses, pretending to skim the pages slowly. I deliberately asked a few naive questions about tax clauses, about the wire transfer, playing my role of a senile old man to perfection. David explained patiently, but I noticed his nervousness in the way he drummed his fingers on the table. Of course, I didn't need to read it, because that contract hadn't been drafted by his lawyer. It had been drafted by Martha Shaw, and she had leaked it to David's lawyer through a third party. And on the fourth page, buried in a tangle of legalese, was our ace in the hole. A small clause stating that, in the event of any dispute over the property before the final signing, a company called Magnolia Legal LLC would have the right of first refusal to acquire the property at the agreed-upon price. Magnolia, the classic American flower. And Magnolia Legal LLC was a small, newly formed company in Chloe's name. I picked up the pen, letting my hand tremble slightly on purpose. I signed at the bottom of the contract. David let out a sigh of relief and quickly gathered the papers, as if afraid I'd changed my mind. "Good, Dad," he said, smiling. You did the right thing. I just nodded. No, son, I thought. I'm the one who just did the right thing. You just took one more step into the trap. As soon as they had my signature on the Napa contract, David and Marcus acted. Confident they had a valuable asset to leverage, they decided to accelerate the legal battle. Martha had predicted it. When an animal is wounded, it becomes more aggressive, she said. They'll try to end this quickly. And so they did. Martha officially filed the lawsuit with the court, requesting the nullification of the will due to forgery, attaching the detailed expert report. The other side's reaction was to immediately request a hearing with the notary to verify the legality of their will. One morning, the mailman brought a bulky envelope. Inside was an official summons from the notary's office appointed by the court, requiring the presence of the interested parties at a hearing in 2 weeks. I called David, maintaining my role as a worried old man. I've received some papers from the court. They're talking about Aunt Sarah's will. Don't worry, Dad. His voice on the other end sounded confident, even condescending. Let my lawyer handle it. Everything will be fine. The truth is on our side. The truth. I almost laughed at his audacity. He was confident because he believed the fake will was perfect. He was confident because he believed I had nothing. That day, after closing the workshop, I didn't go home. I walked to the Old North Church. I didn't go in the main door, but went around to the small office of Father Michael, the elderly priest who had baptized both Sarah and me. We sat in the quiet room, with only the ticking of an old grandfather clock. I told him everything, omitting nothing. He listened, his kind eyes showing not a hint of judgment. When I finished, he stood, took an old ring of keys, and led me to the church archives, a cold place that smelled of damp. He opened a large iron cabinet. Inside, among registry books and old vestments, was a small rusted metal box. Sarah gave this to me to keep many years ago, Father Michael said. She told me to only give it to her brother, Ray, if he came to ask for it in person. I took the box with trembling hands. It was heavier than I expected. I opened it. Inside, wrapped in a white linen cloth, was a stack of handwritten papers. It was Sarah's real will, written in her familiar script, with the tremor appropriate for her age. I held the truth in my hands, a truth that was heavy and painful. The trap was almost complete. Only one last piece was missing, the most important one, and it had to be placed by David's own hand. The combination of the freeze on the assets and the impending lawsuit had forced Marcus Thorne, the financial shark, to act. He needed a more solid guarantee than a pre-contract for land. He needed something he could execute immediately. He needed the shares of the Miller woodshop. Martha, through her complex network of contacts, had found out. She knew Thorne was putting unbearable pressure on David, and she had prepared for it. I wasn't there, but I could picture the scene clearly, as if watching a tragedy. Thorne wouldn't meet David in a luxury office. He'd choose a loud, dramatic place where reason is easily eclipsed by emotion. Maybe a luxury box at Gillette Stadium during a Patriots game. Amid the roar of the crowd, in the middle of the vital tension between the quarterback and the defense, Thorne would slide a contract toward David. It was a collateral agreement for his shares, a legal document that allowed Thorne to take temporary possession of the shares David expected to inherit from the workshop as security for his debts. David, cornered by Thorne's pressure and the artificial euphoria of the game, wouldn't read it carefully. He would only see the one way to keep Thorne funding his plan. And he would sign. And in signing, he wouldn't notice the small clause at the end, a clause subtly introduced by a lawyer in Martha's network who had pretended to work for a third party related to Thorne. The clause stipulated that if the grantor, David, was convicted or criminally charged in relation to the inherited assets, making the inheritance impossible, the collateral shares would not be returned. Instead, they would be preferentially transferred to a pre-designated guarantor. That guarantor, of course, was Chloe's company, Magnolia Legal LLC. I sat in my workshop running my hand over a piece of olive wood. I thought of David, of the defensive line charging the quarterback. He didn't know that behind the line, victory wasn't waiting for him, but the blitz, a blitz he himself had enabled, a blitz that Martha and I had designed together. The last piece had clicked into place. The trap was complete. All that was left was for the prey to fall all the way. It was past midnight. The entire north end was asleep. The only sound was the distant hum of the city, and the orange light from the street lamps cast the shadows of the trees on the brick walls. But in my workshop, a work light was still on. I wasn't waiting. Waiting is a passive act for the weak. I was working. My hand slid a fine grit sandpaper over the wood of an old armchair, a relic from my grandfather. I was restoring it, bringing it back to life, just as I was trying to restore my family's honor. The smell of cedar, olive wood, and linseed oil enveloped me, an aroma of creation, of legacy, a fortress against the rot outside. Then I heard it. Not the familiar sound of a neighbor's engine arriving late, but the sharp squeal of a luxury car braking hard. A door slammed. Then, footsteps, not one, but 3 people, heavy, hurried, and determined on the cobblestone lane. They didn't knock. The heavy oak door of the workshop, which was only ajar, was pushed open hard. 3 silhouettes were framed in the doorway, backlit, blocking the light from the street. The silhouette in the center, though smaller, emanated the most arrogance and desperation. David. He reeked of bourbon and expensive cologne. The 2 accompanying him were bigger, dressed in cheap suits that looked tight and uncomfortable on their bulky bodies. They had the eyes of pit bulls, cold and expressionless, scanning my workshop as if evaluating what they could steal. My sacred space had been profaned. "Working late, old man?" David said, his voice hoarse with alcohol and contained anger. I didn't answer. I slowly put down the sandpaper, brushed the wood dust from my hands, and looked at him directly. He didn't waste time on greetings. He strode to my workbench and threw down a pile of papers. The white sheets flew, landing among the sawdust and my tools. It was a general power of attorney. "Sign it!" he spat. His 2 thugs fanned out, one blocking the exit, the other moving to stand behind me. A threatening presence. I looked at the papers, and then at my son's flushed face and bloodshot eyes. I noticed a slight tremor in his hand. He wasn't the hunter. He was a cornered beast, and there's nothing more dangerous. My right hand was still on the bench, near a gouge I had just sharpened, but my left hand, out of his sight, slipped under the edge of the table, where a small, hard, cold button was, one I had installed weeks ago. "Sign it!" David yelled, his voice echoing in the workshop silence. "Don't make me do this the hard way, old man." I looked at him, not with fear, but with a deep sadness, as heavy as a block of ebony. "The hard way," I thought. "You've already used every way. Deceit, forgery, threats. This is just the last step on a long road you chose." I took a deep breath, the air thick with the smell of wood glue and tension. My voice came out, surprisingly calm, a calm that surprised even him. "You've been doing this the hard way for a long time, David." My calm seemed to enrage David even more. He thought I was challenging him, mocking his impotence. "Who do you think you are?" he roared, taking a step toward me, spitting. "Just a damn carpenter, an old man about to die. Sign." The thug behind me put a heavy hand on my shoulder. His grip was strong enough to buckle anyone, but my shoulders were hardened by 50 years of hauling lumber. I didn't move. My gaze remained fixed on David. It was time. My thumb pressed hard on the hidden button. No shrill alarm sounded, just a small, dry click, almost drowned out by David's growls. A silent signal had been sent. A second passed. 2. David's face twisted into a sneer, thinking my silence was a sign of surrender. Then, the main sliding metal door of the workshop, the one used to move large logs, suddenly rolled aside with a heavy, definitive clang. Powerful flashlight beams cut through the workshop's darkness, aiming directly at the faces of David and his 2 thugs. They squinted, instinctively raising their hands to shield themselves. Several figures entered. They weren't uniformed police. The first to enter was Captain Davis, dressed in a worn tweed jacket. He looked more like a retired professor than a Boston PD captain, but his eyes weren't tired. They were sharp and observant. Right behind him came Martha Shaw, tall and straight in her black suit. Her glacial face showed no emotion, and behind her, 2 men in suits carrying leather briefcases, the 2 court-appointed attorneys. David's face went through a cascade of expressions in seconds, from shock to confusion, then to recognition, and finally to the desperate fury of someone who has fallen into a trap. His 2 henchmen were frozen, completely disoriented. The script had changed too quickly. "You set me up!" David screamed, pointing a trembling finger at me, his voice broken with rage and disbelief. "You set me up!" Captain Davis ignored his screams. He approached, his voice monotone, with a terrifying calm, cutting through the outburst. "David Miller, I'm Captain Davis of the Boston PD. We received a call about a possible felony coercion and threats to force the signing of documents for the purpose of asset appropriation at this address. I'm going to ask you all to stay right where you are while we work." Martha Shaw stepped up to the workbench and gently placed a small digital recorder on top of the power of attorney. A tiny red light was still blinking. "And I believe," her cold voice echoed through the workshop, "that all the evidence, from the verbal threats to the physical coercion, has been duly recorded." I looked at David, at his face, twisted by rage. I didn't feel satisfaction. I didn't feel victory. Only an overwhelming sadness, a loss I couldn't name. Like when you discover a joint has cracked from the inside, a flaw impossible to repair. It was the sadness for the glue that could never bond a father and son. The creation space had become a crime scene. The cold light of the flashlight swept over my tools, the half-finished pieces of wood creating grotesque shadows on the walls. The click of cameras sounded, documenting every detail. The power of attorney on the table, the scared faces of the two thugs. And David, who had now collapsed into a chair, his head in his hands. Captain Davis worked methodically, without raising his voice, without rushing. He and another officer separated the two henchmen to opposite corners of the workshop to take their statements. I heard fragments of mumbled answers, weak denials. They were just pawns, and they knew it. The two attorneys, the objective witnesses of the law, began their work. They took note of the scene, certified my condition, David's, and sealed the power of attorney and Martha's recorder in an evidence bag. Their presence transformed a chaotic family confrontation into a clear and irrefutable legal case. An officer made a call. I heard the name Marcus Thorne mentioned. After a brief exchange, the officer informed Captain Davis. "Captain, subject's known addresses are empty. He's gone." The spider had felt the vibration in the web and cut the thread to escape, leaving the fly behind. Thorne was a professional. He would never get caught in such an amateur way. Only David, my naive and desperate son, was left to face the consequences. While all this chaos unfolded, I slowly approached my grandfather's old armchair, the piece I was restoring. I picked up a soft cloth and carefully wiped a layer of dust that had just settled on the newly polished armrest. A small, meaningless act in the middle of that scene. But for me, it was a way to stay sane, to reestablish who I was. Even if the world was falling apart, a carpenter must finish his work. Wood is still wood, and a beautiful grain is still a beautiful grain. In woodworking, I thought, there are adhesives that need time to cure. Once they're set, the bond is stronger than the wood itself. My plan was the same. The glue set many years ago. You just didn't have the patience to see it. Dawn was breaking over the Charles River, painting the sky a rosy color. The peace of the morning contrasted violently with the night before. I was sitting in Martha Shaw's office with a cup of cold coffee I hadn't touched. Chloe was by my side, silent, her hand resting gently on mine, a wordless comfort. Martha, however, showed no signs of fatigue. She was like a legal machine, freshly charged with energy. She paced the room, phone in hand, her voice sharp and authoritative. "Yes, Your Honor, yes, the preliminary police report, case number 2025-A34. Correct. There are clear indications of felony threats and coercion. I am requesting an immediate preemptive freeze on all accounts." She was delivering the final blows. With the police report from the night before as irrefutable proof of criminal intent, she was demanding the court act, and the dominoes began to fall. First, an urgent freeze order was issued. All of David's personal and business bank accounts were frozen. His cash flow, the thing he adored above all else, had been cut off. Now he couldn't pay his lawyers, he couldn't pay his creditors, he couldn't do anything. Second, Martha requested the nullification of the pre-contract for the Napa land. "With the evidence of fraudulent conduct and bad faith," she explained to Chloe and me, "we can prove the contract was signed under duress. The court will declare it void." And by voiding the contract, the penalty clause was activated. the very one we had introduced. The prey hadn't just been trapped, the trapdoor beneath his feet was now opening. Chloe's company, Magnolia Legal LLC, now had the legal right to acquire the entire Napa property at the ridiculously low price originally agreed upon. Chloe, my young niece, was now sitting across from Martha, reviewing the legal documents with professional concentration. She was no longer just a paralegal. The weight of the legacy and the responsibility had matured her overnight. She was the one signing the papers as the administrator of Magnolia Legal LLC. The power was being transferred silently, but definitively. I sat there like a spectator. The legal machinery I had helped set in motion was now running on its own with overwhelming force. I felt a strange detachment. The exhaustion of a general after the decisive battle is over. The war had been won. But seeing the sadness in Chloe's eyes, seeing the emptiness in my own heart, I knew the price had been terribly high. The appointed law office was on Newbury Street, the commercial heart of Boston. But the conference room we were led to had none of the street's bustle. It was perfectly soundproofed, an airtight box, solemn and oppressive. The walls were paneled in dark oak, and the floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with leather-bound legal codes looked like the bricks of a fortress of justice. The sunlight, normally bright and warm, filtered through the thick glass, weakened and cold, casting pale reflections on the long, polished mahogany table. I sat in silence, my back straight, my hands on my knees. Chloe was next to me, also silent, but I could feel the tension in every one of her muscles. She wore a navy blue suit that made her look older, but her eyes couldn't hide her anxiety. Across from us was David. It was the first time I had seen him clearly in the daylight since the night in the workshop. He looked dreadful. His face was puffy, with deep dark circles under his eyes from lack of sleep, his expensive suit wrinkled. Next to him, a young, equally nervous lawyer kept shuffling through papers. At the head of the table sat the notary, Mr. Wallace, a middle-aged man with graying hair and an expressionless face, the face of someone who has witnessed too many family dramas to be moved. And to one side, separate, sat Martha Shaw, sharp and upright as a razor, her dossier placed in front of her, orderly and threatening. Mr. Wallace cleared his throat, and the slight sound echoed in the heavy silence. "Let's begin," he said. "The purpose of this hearing is to verify the legality of the documents relating to the estate of the deceased Mrs. Sarah Miller." He began by stating David's claim, based on the handwritten will he had submitted. David's lawyer presented his case with a shaky voice, appealing to the aunt's love for her only nephew. When he finished, Martha said nothing. She simply slid a dossier toward Mr. Wallace. "We request that the notary examine the forensic document analysis report, number 734B, prepared by the Judicial Forensics Institute of New York." Mr. Wallace put on his glasses and began to read the main conclusions aloud. Every word he spoke was a hammer blow on the coffin of the lie. The chromatographic analysis of the ink shows that the type of ink used did not exist on the date the document was allegedly written. I saw David shift uncomfortably in his seat. The microscopic analysis of the paper fibers shows that the type of paper does not correspond to that which Mrs. Miller habitually used. David's lawyer began to sweat. And finally, the signature analysis. Mr. Wallace paused, looking up to stare at David over his glasses. It concludes that the signature shows signs of slow imitation, lacks naturalness and fluency, and is the product of a deliberate forgery. He set the report down. Based on this irrefutable evidence, I declare the document presented by Mr. David Miller to be a forgery and to be without any legal validity. Then he picked up another stack of papers, yellowed papers that I had given him earlier. "However, we have received another document, also a handwritten will from Mrs. Miller, entrusted to a third party." He began to read my sister's real will aloud. His voice was monotone, without emotion, but every word she had written resonated in my mind, warm and familiar. She wrote about her love for this city, for the workshop, for the family traditions. She mentioned me with gratitude, and Chloe with all the tenderness of a mother. And then came the distribution of assets. The family home was for Chloe. The savings were to create a scholarship fund for young carpenters, and the most important part, the soul of the family, the entirety of the shares of the Miller woodshop, she bequeathed to Chloe, with the hope that she continues the legacy of honesty, craftsmanship, and dignity. Finally, Mr. Wallace read the part dedicated to David. To my nephew, David Miller, his voice resonated, because of the love I have for him and also because of the worry his future causes me, I bequeath him a monthly stipend sufficient to cover his basic needs. This stipend will be deducted from the workshop's profits under the following conditions. First, that he completes a certified treatment program for gambling and financial management. Second, that he works in the Miller woodshop for a minimum period of 18 months under the supervision of Chloe so that he may relearn the value of honest work. Silence gripped the room. Suddenly, David shot up from his chair. It fell backward with a crack. His face was contorted, red with rage and shame. "This is ridiculous," he shouted, his voice breaking. "She never would have written that. She loved me. This is fake too. You're all in on it to destroy me." He pointed at me, at Chloe, at Martha. "It's a conspiracy." Mr. Wallace took off his glasses and looked at him with exhaustion. "Mr. Miller, this document has been validated. I must ask you to maintain your composure. Otherwise, I will have to call security." David's fury vanished quickly, replaced by the confusion of a cornered animal. He slumped back into his chair, muttering something unintelligible. It was then that Martha acted. She didn't stand. She simply straightened in her seat, projecting an overwhelming sense of power. She didn't look at David, a snub worse than any reprimand. She addressed Mr. Wallace, but her voice was loud enough for everyone to hear. "Mr. Notary, there is one last matter that must be clarified, relating to the terms of the legal will that has just been proclaimed." She slid another dossier toward the center of the table. It had a dark blue cover, modern and cold compared to the yellowed will. "This is a copy of a collateral agreement for shares signed between Mr. David Miller and a financial entity belonging to Mr. Marcus Thorne." David's lawyer jumped, turning to look at his client in disbelief. It was clear David hadn't informed him of this transaction. Martha continued, her voice icy. "According to this contract, Mr. Miller pledged the entirety of the shares he expected to inherit from the Miller woodshop as collateral for a personal loan." She turned to the last page and pointed to a clause. "Allow me to read Clause 7.4, she said. "In the event that the grantor is criminally charged or convicted in direct relation to the inherited assets, or if the grantor's inheritance is voided for any reason, preventing the transfer of the pledged asset, said shares shall not be returned to the grantor, but will be preferentially transferred to a third party designated as the contract's guarantor." She paused, letting the silence flood the room. I looked at David. His face was beginning to turn pale. He didn't seem to understand the full scope of what was happening, but his debtor's instinct told him something terrible was about to occur. Martha delivered the final, definitive, mortal blow. "Mr. Notary, the first will having been declared a forgery, and with the evidence of coercion and threats being investigated by the Boston PD, Mr. Miller's inheritance under any scenario has been voided. Therefore, Clause 7.4 has been activated." She slid one last document onto the table. "And here is the documentation for the designated guarantor in the contract, a company called Magnolia Legal LLC." Mr. Wallace examined the papers and then looked up at Chloe. David finally understood. The connection sparked in his stunned brain. Magnolia, the company, Chloe. The contract he had signed in a panic at Gillette Stadium. He didn't scream this time. He just opened his mouth. His eyes were wide, looking at Martha, then at me, then at Chloe. The blood had completely drained from his face, leaving a waxy, sweat-covered skin. He hadn't just lost everything. Worse, he realized that it was he, with his own hand, who had signed the document that gave everything away to the very person he wanted to harm the most. He had been the architect of his own ruin. He collapsed slowly in the chair, not with rage, but limply, as if his spine had been removed. He was completely empty. I looked at my son, a man of almost 40, who now looked like a lost, broken, and pathetic child. I felt no victory. I only felt a profound tragedy. The last piece had fit. The plan had worked to perfection, but the price was a shattered soul. The next morning, the Boston sky was a strange, cloudless blue. The air was crisp, infused with the smell of the nearby ocean and freshly brewed coffee from the cafes. Chloe and I were on the workshop's balcony, the one overlooking the red brick rooftops of the North End. She handed me a cup of coffee, the steam rising in the cool air. We didn't say anything, just silently watched the city wake up. The chaos of the last few weeks seemed to have vanished, leaving a somewhat empty calm. Chloe had changed. She was no longer just a young paralegal. The weight of responsibility had fallen on her shoulders, making her seem more mature, but also stronger. Last night, after leaving the notary's office, she had stayed with me at the workshop late, going over ledgers, blueprints, listening to me explain every type of wood, every half-finished project. She learned quickly, with a concentration and respect that filled me with pride. Sarah's legacy, the Miller family legacy, was in the right hands. My phone vibrated in my pocket. A new message. I took it out. It was from an unknown number, but I knew who it was. Just 3 words. Dad, I'm sorry. I stared at the text for a long time. 3 simple words, but they contained a world of late repentance, of failure, and perhaps a fragile glimmer of hope. I thought of David, the bright-eyed boy who used to follow me around the workshop, breathing in the smell of sawdust and asking me hundreds of questions. Where had that boy gone? Chloe noticed my silence. "Who is it, Uncle Ray?" she asked quietly. I didn't answer right away. I turned off the phone's screen and put it away. I took a deep breath of the morning air. "Are you going to answer him?" Chloe asked, her voice full of compassion. I shook my head, not with anger, but with weariness. I looked out toward the sun rising over the harbor. "There are some joints, Chloe, that once they're broken, can never be repaired to be like they were," I said, my voice low. "You can add glue, you can put in a brace, but they'll never get their original strength back. The crack will always be there. I've done what I had to do. Now, it's time to build something new, with good, sound wood." I put my hand on her shoulder, squeezing gently, confidently. A carpenter's justice doesn't need shouting, I thought. It doesn't need cheers or gloating. It just needs to be measured with precision, cut straight, and joined firmly. And when the dawn breaks, it remains silent and solid, like a piece of furniture made to last for generations. If this story captivated you, give the video a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To listen to the next story, click the box on the left of the screen. Thanks for watching.